Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending Jim's memorial service. On behalf of Kay and her family and Jim's family, I welcome you all here. We're live streaming to Australia. There's no extra costs, I promise you. This service has been put together. That's something Jim and I sat round his armchair in the home St Anthony's and put together and planned, and the music he chose, everything basically he chose. He wanted something very simple and very, he called it ordinary. So we're here to do that, and we pay respects to a wonderful man. We've all got our own individual memories of Jim, one way or another. I can remember the lovely disagreements between him and George, which was best, classical or the jive. And George always said the jive and Jim always said classical. And I think they agreed on pop music in the end. But Jim was a unique character. And when he became a member of our fast and firm community here, Jim was very active with all parts of the church in different ways and formats. And during lockdown, every Saturday, he read his poetry for a number of hours. And I think some people didn't want it, but he still read it. And it was great, really great. And he became a close friend. I used to try and visit him when I can. And in the very early days, I couldn't get past the front door. He'd poke his head round and chat to me. Then gradually we met, and I'd take him a coffee from the coffee store in Mitcham High Street, which he always enjoyed. And he did love his black coffee, didn't he? And it had to be just right. And he even got to a point he was bringing his own coffee here. So he had the right coffee, a bit like my father-in-law, except my father-in-law had to have the right pint and the right glass. Jim was any mug, but the right coffee. He was quite fussy about that. So different people are going to talk today, and then the committal of the ashes, we're going to go out to the Garden of Remembrance. It's for the family only. People can go and look afterwards if you want to, but we're just doing it because Jim just wanted a private moment with his family. And so I said, I won't go then. He said, no, you have to be there. And Leslie, don't forget Leslie. So I said, I won't forget Leslie. So friends, dear friends, we're privileged to be here to commemorate the journey of our dear friend Jim and fellow worker into the spiritual realms, and for those bright lights which awaited him. He is now reunited with his family and his friends. And it's important that we as spiritualists understand that. And it was important for Jim to say that because Jim gave up his Catholicism for over 30 years to become a spiritualist. And he asked for a spiritualist naming service. He wanted to reinforce his belief in spiritualism. And I remember one of the visits I had with him when he was in St George's. Catholic priest came round because it was on his file, he was a Catholic priest. And this young priest stood in front of him and he went, what do you want? And Jim said, the priest said, Mr. Blyth, I'm your priest. He said, I ain't one of yours anymore. I found a better place. I said, Jim, be respectful. He went, I am. I could have told him off, couldn't I? But he wasn't well and he was on drugs. But I loved Jim's honesty. I loved his plain and simple ways of talking. Sometimes it got complicated when he tried to explain to me the chords of a guitar. And I said, Jim, it's going above my head. He said, what was that? I said, it was the A chord, B chord, G chord, whatever it was. And he laughed. I was also surprised to find out that Jim had a skiffle group in the 50s, playing skiffle. And he loved that. And I believe there are pictures. I don't know if you've come across any of the skiffle pictures, but there are, he said, hymns of playing a guitar, I think. So it was his skiffle group days. So, but Jim had many talents. And iPhones and WhatsApp wasn't one of them. Those who know what I'm talking about. And especially at 2:30, 3:30 in the morning. But he was a great friend to us all in our own individual and unique ways. So I asked now Ashley to play the opening music. I've gone beyond myself, but the opening music is a piece of music I introduced to Jim, and Jim said he wanted here at the service. It's Brahms.
Afternoon, everybody. It's all right, this looks worse than it is. It's just I've put it down in big writing. There'll be a few of us talking today about Jim's life, but I wanted to share with you some of my personal memories. I was first introduced to Jim after his wife Sylvie passed away. Jim was a practicing Catholic at the time, but Sylvie was a spiritualist. So Jim came to talk to Ray about her funeral, as she wasn't sure how to proceed. At that time, I'd only just been ordained, so Ray thought it might be nice if I conducted Sylvie's funeral. We had a detailed discussion with Jim on what he would like said at the funeral and if he'd like to read any poems or the eulogy. And Jim said that he did readings at church and he was used to public speaking, but of course this would be much harder and more emotional for him. The funeral service went very well, and Jim asked me afterwards, "Did I do okay, Les?" I said, "You were amazing and very strong." From that day on, Jim had a special place in my heart. Jim was worried about where he would lay Sylvie's ashes, and it was decided that Sylvie would be interred in our church garden of remembrance, along with the ashes of their precious dog, Patch. Jim was overwhelmed with the kindness that Ray and Jackie showed him. Jim was an amazing man who, over time, became to our church more and more. He said felt very comfortable here and very welcome. His visits to the Catholic Church became less and less until he stopped going completely and eventually became a spiritualist and had a naming service conducted here at Wimbledon. Our church became his second home. We all enjoyed his bread pudding and his mince pies that he used to make us at Christmas. Jim loved poetry, as did Sylvie, and Sylvie wrote a wonderful poetry book, and Jim had this published for her. It was his pride and joy, and he always carried a copy of it around with him. Jim loved to tell stories about his life, how he flew a plane, was a bus driver, worked at a fish farm, and would drive people in a taxi to Ronnie Scott's club in London. The problem was he forgot who he told it to, so we all heard those stories so many times each, but we didn't mind. At the grand old age of 82, Jim asked me if he was too old to become a spiritual healer. I said, of course not, as long as he realised it would be a big commitment. So Jim started his healing journey. I used to say he was my star pupil, as in the 2 years he only missed 2 classes, and that was because he was in hospital having a shoulder operation, and he still came to class with his sling on. As Jim volunteered for the St John's ambulance, his knowledge of the body was great, so he did really well on the anatomy tests. On a Friday, Jim would always be here early for class, making sure everything was opened up and that he had put on the heating on so it'd be nice and warm when we all got here. I could still see him in my mind's eye, sitting at the table with his favourite black coffee in his special mug, listening to his music on his phone, waiting for us to arrive. Jim would bring his papers and his healing manual in a bag which was really heavy, and he always had a big waterproof coat and trousers just in case it rained. The girls would nag him that it was too heavy for him and he struggled with it, but Jim, being stubborn, wouldn't take any notice. Eventually, for a quiet life, he listened and bought himself a pull-along trolley, which helped a bit. Jim was so proud to have passed his healing assessment, and we were very proud of him too. A little while after he passed his healing, we began to notice that he was getting a little bit forgetful and he needed more help. Unfortunately, Jim's health deteriorated. He had some falls, and as his family didn't live locally, we gave the hospital and the doctors our numbers. There was many a time that Ray and myself would rush up the hospital after a call, out of visiting times in our ministerial regalia, and the staff in the hospital would look quite shocked, probably wondering who we would come in to give the last rites to. Poor Jim had many stays in hospital, and he loved to watch the seagulls out the window. One particular seagull would come and sit on the window ledge, and Jim called him Sonny Jim. I looked on Amazon for a soft toy seagull to buy him, and it took me ages to find one that looked just like Sonny Jim. Jim was really pleased with his seagull, and I put him in a tissue box just like to go to bed. As time went on, Jim found life more of a struggle, and we did as much as we could to help him. Jim had his flat updated, so he had to stay in a hotel for a few weeks. He really enjoyed being there, as he got 2 meals a day and didn't have to cook. He really enjoyed his favourite chili con carne and curry. While he was there, he got an infection and had to have antibiotics. I must admit, the instructions on the medicine box weren't very clear, but I went to see him and he was so proud of himself, telling me that he'd taken the tablets every 20 minutes as directed. I explained that the pills were meant to last him for 7 days, but as Jim would be, he said, "Oh, well, it doesn't matter, at least I've taken them." Typical Jim. Many of you will know the fun and games Jim calls with his phone by keep pressing all the buttons so no one could contact him. He would get it on airplane mode, block people by accident, and one day he even managed to get all his calls to go to Amazon. As I was dealing with his phone for him, the chap in the shop said he had no idea how Jim managed it. We had many trips to EE, which ended up with me buying him 4 different phones, and in the end we just gave up and hid them. Our trips to the shop, Jim and I would link arms. I don't really know if he was holding me up or I was holding him up. He thought it was great that he could walk up the stairs quicker than I could, and he would take the mickey out and be saying, "Come on, Liz, hurry up." By now, Jim was not just part of our church family, he was part of my family. Eventually, Jim had to go into a nursing home to be looked after, and we would take it in turns to make sure he had visitors. We would usually take some cakes up for him, and I'd say, "Do you fancy a cake, Jim?" And he'd say, "Well, I suppose I could," as though he was doing me a favour by eating them. Jim loved his classical music, and the staff would often play some for him, and Jim would sit there humming away and pretending to conduct the music. He would be in his element. When we went to see him, we would always tell him what was happening in church and how everyone was doing, and that everyone missed him. I will never forget you, Jim, and the laughs we had together. You already let many of us know you're here and you're okay. Now you can come back to church. Who knew when I first met you what a big impact you would have had on my life and how special you became to me, Jim. You will always have a special place in my heart. God bless you, Jim. Oh, deep breaths. I've got to do another one.
Can't stop talking, can you?
So this is a poem that I picked for Jim because I thought it was very nice. Don't think of him as gone away. His journey's just begun. Life holds so many facets. The earth is only one. Just think of him as resting from the sorrows and the tears in a place of warmth and comfort where there are no days or years. Think how he must be wishing that we could know today how nothing but our sadness can really pass away. And think of him as living in the hearts of those he touched, for nothing loved is ever lost, and he was loved so much.
We now have another short piece of music, followed by Joanne Ramsey afterwards. Lady singing was one of Jim's favourites. He loved that lady's voice, and at one time he missed and lost her music indoors, and he was quite distraught, but he managed to find it again. So it was really nice to be able to hear that. Joanne, would you like to come up and say your few words, please?
Afternoon, everyone. I know Jim through the church, and Jim was also my neighbour. He just lived opposite me, so I'd pop across there and help him with his technology or bring him over to mine because it was easier. But Jim Blyth was his birth name, but he was known as Jim to those who knew him as family, husband, friend, and even newly met acquaintances. The way his name was said depended on what Jim was getting up to. It could range from, "Oh, Jim," said with warmth, or "Oh, Jim," said with despondency when he blocks up WhatsApp for his Saturday poetry corner. Kay probably felt like that as you listened to his poems each week. Yeah. Jim was part of our healing course. We were similar to Enid Blyton's famous five, except that there were six of us. There was Jim, Phil, Elizabeth, Annabelle, and Teresa, and myself. And we were taught by and kept in line by Leslie, as you can see, and Danielle, who's at the back over there. And due to COVID, what should have been a 2-year course took 4 years, And I don't know who was most pleased when it finished, but I do know that Leslie went and lay down in a darkened room for a while. However, that time allowed us to form a bonds and unbreakable bonds with each other, and that was demonstrated through Jim's ups and downs. So this including Teresa, never being sure if Jim was diabetic, but always buying cakes to take to him to thank him for having warmed the church up for us beforehand. Jim always relished this and chatted away with her until the next person arrived. As you've heard, Jim was such a talented and gifted man. He was someone who took control of his own destiny. It's no secret that he married 3 times. His stories spoke of him being a really good husband, from courting to nursing, each in a way that showed tenderness, love, and dedication. At times during his decline, I used to pray and wish that he could experience some of this degree of care with more regularity. It was only after his transition that I knew he did, just maybe not in the way that I understood. Jim was very loved and respected. Quite frequently, I'd send pictures and updates of how he was, and Elizabeth, through her visits and her being so eagle-eyed, would always look deeper than the surface level to see and say what she thought was needed. Some people were not able to visit for various reasons. So Jim may have been out of sight for many, but he was never out of mind. However, what they did do was to send thoughts and prayers and healing to him, and Annabelle was one of them, as did people here and beyond who received updates about Jim through this church. I'm sure that Phil, who transitioned before him, kept Jim going by exchanging jokes, not always of a spiritual kind, Jim had a great sense of humour, and even to the end, sometimes when he didn't seem in his best space, I'd sit there with him and I'd stroke his hand, and kiss his forehead and his cheeks. And then the nursing home bell would ring, or one of the residents, would shout out something. And then all of a sudden, Jim would pipe up with, "Shut up." And then I'd know he was still holding on and finding a joy in his own way, of life. Jim expressed his love and gratitude for the kindness he received from one assistant in particular. On asking him to confirm that she was his friend, she would lean forwards and he in return would kiss her on the cheek and smile. And I'd call him a cheeky chappy or something similar, I knew Jim was up for being married again because he said,
Yeah.
could he have been considering her as wife number 4? Who knows, I first met Jim at the former Hackbridge Spiritualist Church. And one Christmas, he provided us with these mince pies you've heard about, and for those of you who tasted them, it's not an understatement. I'd never before or since tasted pastry so good. And to say that they would melt in the mouth was an understatement. I had asked Jim for the recipe and always thought that I'd get to it at some point. That never happened. As the man who was able to recall points of anatomy, as Leslie said, and physiology from his boyhood with the days in St. John's Ambulance, rapidly lost his ability to communicate verbally. He that had kept the church warm for us by taking buses and walking became immobile. May the changes and the speed at which they happened serve as a reminder for us to enjoy each moment. May the way that Jiv lived his life be a reminder for us to give thanks and gratitude for what we have, rather than what we still want and need. Like the biblical bird of the air, Jim's needs were met until the moment of his last breath. Jim's strength, persistence, determination continues. He's come through quite a few times, as you've heard already, included in a message to me. I'm sincerely grateful to have had Jim as part of my life. He's left an indelible print, and I'm sure I'm not alone. Here's to Mr. Jim Blyth. Thank you.
We've now got another piece of music that Jim chose, Beethoven's Fifth. He said he wanted to go out on a bang.
Good afternoon. For those that don't know me, I'm Jackie Robinson, co-president with Ray and one of the ministers here, and just I've known Jim for that whole period of time that he started to come after Sylvia had passed. And he was my right-hand man, actually, but he was so reliable and he was dependable as well. Occasionally with the Friendship Club, if it was suddenly a school holiday, then I knew that I could ask Jim to be here early to open up, to make sure that people were in, and to then lock up for us if I wasn't able to attend. And that's really good when you've got a right-hand man that you know can do that. And he was brilliant, because it's not always easy coming and being the one that puts the heating on. So you're going into a cold room to warm it up for everyone else. But as I say, he was very reliable, and you know, it was great being able to know that I had someone to trust. But there were other bits and pieces that Jim helped me with. We like to decorate. You can probably see from behind me, we've just done the wow of the sunflowers, because sunflowers are the emblem of spiritualism. And I certainly remember it was probably last year when we were doing the same. It was one of the occasions. I changed the curtains about 2 or 3 times a year. And I had really bad arthritic feet. So I suddenly couldn't lift my foot to go on to the first level of the ladder. So Jim actually got up on the ladders and changed the curtains for me, which was great because, you know, neither of us were spring chickens, but I'm a little bit more of a spring chicken than Jim. And he was up there and he was helping me with the flowers, which was marvellous. So every time, you know, I put the curtains up now and, you know, have volunteers, then I think that Jim was able to do that. He was also a very good photographer. At one point, he had a photography business, and you know, he was able to print out photographs, and he'd taken probably hundreds of photographs at church of different mediums and different events that we had, and you know, he was quite talented with able to do that. And the christenings, he's taken photographs of the christenings and taken some really nice casual photographs. Whenever he was invited to a wedding or a christening to attend, then he would be there to be able to do that. So, you know, I say I miss him, but I do feel him around. In fact, it was only last week when we were here at Friendship Club and I felt him around and he said to me, he thought he'd have a laugh and he said, I brought the bus with me and I've parked it in the bus lane. He said, I wonder if any bus drivers will feel the presence of a bus because I brought this one from Spirit with me. And I thought, oh, that'd be amazing, isn't it? That, you know, bus drivers are coming down from the top of the road thinking, is there a bus there? And then not really sure. So I thought it was great that Jim had brought his bus. But I remember all these stories of going to the fish farm and driving all over the place and, you know, he'd often say, oh, you can get a bus through that, you know, when there was a gap or something. And he didn't think bus drivers of today, you know, had the discipline and the teachings and the training to do with the driving. But I thought it was great that he actually brought his bus with him last week. And I know that Les has already told some stories, and so has Joanne. But as I say, his pastry was definitely to die for, you know, and he added lots of extra fruit. That was his secret as well. It wasn't just in the pastry. But the bread pudding that he made, I think when he told me, he put about 2 to 3 pounds of raisins and currants in, which is far more than recipe, but it did mean that it was out of this world bread pudding. And he did that until his cooker wasn't working and his kitchen was falling apart. And, you know, but he really did enjoy being able to be part of that, bringing things in, making, you know, the fact that we are a family unit here. We're the heart of the church, the group that is here. And Jim came away with us with weekends as well. So we'd look after him for those weekends. And he really enjoyed the company of people here and just being able to come along and, you know, meet with people and to have some good conversations and some spiritual conversations as well about life eternal and the fact that, you know, we are eternal beings having a physical life, but being eternal beings going back to a spiritual life. So I'm very sure that he's, you know, sharing his time equally amongst his 3 dear wives that he was very fond of, and that he's making sure that he keeps all 3 of them happy. And also being able to go on to do more learning and more understanding. And as I say, his poetry, you know, he was great at being able to read a poem. And, you know, during the COVID months into years, you know, he would compile perhaps even 30, 40. Did he even do 50 one time with poem? And it was like 3 hours solid on a Saturday morning of Jim's poetry readings, to be able to be part of that, just so that we were all linking up on WhatsApp, so we didn't lose that connection, which was so important for Jim if he hadn't have been coming here. But I think Jim was here, you know, most days of the week. You know, when Dawn started her circle a couple of years back now, wasn't it? He would come. He wasn't even going into the circle, he was just coming so that he could open up, turn the heating on, have the, you know, yeah, exactly. And then closing up just to make sure that there was a presence. So it was a bit of a minder for me as well. So make sure that everything was okay. You know, and he would come for the healing, he would come for the services. And then it was rather strange because we have our own little camera system here so that we can see if somebody's suddenly in the church. And during the few months that he was becoming a little bit forgetful, we would suddenly be aware that our camera was telling us somebody was at the church. And it was like 8 o'clock of an evening, and Jim was saying, because we'd call him out from the camera and say, Jim, why are you at church? And he said, well, I'm here and nobody else is here yet. And we'd say, but Jim, it's 8 o'clock in the evening. And he said, well, can't I stay until the service in the morning? And I said, no, Jim, you need to go home. You need to be able to do that, because his concept of time was one of the first things, unfortunately, that started to go. And we were finding him here at all sorts of times, in the evening, during the early hours of the morning. How on earth he ever got here? And I know, you can look at it with humour, because Jim would look at it with humour now that he's got a lovely clear head, because he arrived for a brother-in-law's service at the crematorium, but at 2 o'clock in the morning for a 2 o'clock in the afternoon service. And the police were called, and they escorted him home. And on another occasion, he had like I think a 12 o'clock appointment during the day to see a nurse at his doctor's, and he turned up at midnight, and he was rattling. He thought, I can't understand. So the concept, whether it was light or whether it was dark, seemed to be one of the first things for Jim to go. But I know I can mention that, because I know Jim would now look at it and think, did I really do that? Did I really? Because he was so spot on with timekeeping and being there on time. But I think sometimes being 12 hours early for 8 o'clock in the evening to be there for 8 o'clock in the morning, is dedication. But as I say, missed his physical presence, but I know that, he's around and protecting the church and chatting to all those that have been in the church before. And we know that you'll be around us, Jim, and, give us your little stories and just make your physical presence known. So to a gentleman, to a lovely person, kind-hearted, and a really helpful person. So Jim, keep coming back to us. Thank you.
Okay, as Kay makes her way up to the lectern to come and speak to us, I just want to mention a little thing Jim did for my grandson Ethan. Ethan was having piano lessons, and the piano lessons had to stop for one reason or another. I can't remember. And I also said how sorry we were going to try. And the next day he phoned me up and met me here. And the strange thing was, he could have met me at home, which was nearer, but he met me here, and he'd struggled with a keyboard about that long, about that wide. And he said, I thought Ethan might like this. And Ethan carried on for another few months. So he was a great help. And when Ethan tried to help him a couple of times with shopping, he said, no, you're only a little boy. I'm a man and I need to do this myself. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jim's niece, Kay Singer. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I don't think I've really got much to add to all the stories that you've just said with the poetry. I often used to say to my husband when the phone went, Saturday morning, about 10 o'clock, picture of Uncle Jim would be on there. And I'll go, see you in a couple of hours, while I went and sat and listened to all his stories of what happened in the week and then recited all the poems. So I did get to hear them too. The main thing I'm here for now is, obviously he's got a brother who lives in Australia who obviously can't be here. So he's sent some words that he would like me to say for him. So this is from Peter. My brother Jim was a gentleman and a pacifist. We grew up in a rough neighbourhood in Carshalton, and fighting was a way of life. But Jim hated violence. Kids would goad and push him and even hit at him. He would step out of the way, but he would never retaliate. I asked him one day why he didn't hit them back. He said he just couldn't hurt anyone or anything. He loved classical and operatic music, even from a young age. Our father threatened to break the records he bought because he didn't like the music, so we'd hide them in my room where he wouldn't think to look. In 1951, when I was 12 and he was 14, he asked me to go to the latest big film with him called The Great Caruso, a biography of the operatic tenor Enrico Caruso, which was played by Mario Lanza. He had 2 tickets, but nobody to go with, so he asked me. I wasn't very keen to go, but I went to keep him company, and I absolutely loved it. It changed my mind about opera. When we got home, we both tried to sing Nessun Dorma and hit the big notes at the end, but we didn't know the words and definitely couldn't hit the big notes like they do. I've loved that song ever since. He was a master at electronics. If anyone in our neighbourhood had a broken radio or television, they would bring it to Jim and he would fix it. He also used to make tiny crystal radios that fit inside a matchbox. You could hear them make crackling noises like an ordinary radio, and then the news would come on. He did visit us in Australia once when we were living on the farm. He couldn't believe how many stars came out at night because he was used to living near lots of lights, but we lived fairly remote and 800 kilometres from Perth. He used to sit outside for hours looking at them. He also couldn't believe there were no planes going overhead because where he lived they were constant. In the last few years before he went into care, we would talk for hours on the telephone. Occasionally we'd also do a video call. I love that we connected in that way. I miss those calls with him and I miss my brother. And then this is a message from his daughter Donna. My favourite memories of Uncle Jim includes when we were kids, getting a Christmas present every year from him and Auntie Pell, who was his first wife. It seemed so exotic to me to get a present all the way from England, and they were clothes and other goodies that we didn't see here. It was a very generous gesture from them both. The other one was when I was travelling in Europe in 1989. Uncle Jim took me to the Biggin Hill Air Show. We spent hours staring up at the sky, with Uncle Jim telling me all about the planes. My favourites were the red arrows. I have loads of photos from that day and remember it with fondness. When I visited my parents, I would help them to make video calls to Uncle Jim, which felt so much more personal than just talking on the phone. And thanks to my cousin Kay, we was able to do this, even when Uncle Jim went into hospital. It unfortunately ended up being the last call we had with him, but we were grateful to have had the opportunity. Rest in peace amongst those stars you love so much, Uncle Jim. So, and I also want to say thank you all so much for being there for him. I know that he would have loved to, I'm sure he did thank you enough times, but from all of my family and everything, we're also grateful for everything that you did for him. Thank you.
Well, as spiritualists, we know we haven't lost him. He's with us and remains with us. And the emotional words that Kay spoke touch our hearts because he was a very, very unique man. And I have my personal memories. I know Leslie does, Dawn does, and all of you sitting here having your memories of him. But those memories don't die. They're immortal. They're eternal. They remain with us and we share with them. And when we've spoken this afternoon about Jim and laughed and joked, we're not taking the mickey out of him. But I do remember one of the rows he had before leaving the Roman Catholic Church is that Jim never really felt he had a hearing problem. It was you. And the priest shouted across the road or across the church at Jim, "Can't hear you, can't hear you." And Jim said, "I can hear you, shut up." They didn't talk much after that. I truly found sometimes it very emotional visiting Jim. The things we talked about, his memories of the past, his joys, his sadnesses. And I know how much he touched, as Leslie said, my family's lives, but he touched ours. So as we now go our separate ways, Father of love, as we go our separate ways, encouraged and upheld by this service, grant that this blessing may go with us, holding in our minds the thoughts that link us closely to our dear one in the spirit world. With grateful hearts we thank thee for the love thy help is passed on to us by thy angel messengers. May we ever respond to their holy guidance. So when we pass through the short stage of earthly life, strengthened in faith and with our vision surely fixed upon the glorious life that is to come. Jim, God bless you until we meet again. Amen. And Jim asked me to read this blessing and asked also if you, those who can to please stand. There is a peace of God that passes all understanding, keeps our hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of his Son, our elder brother, Jesus. And with the blessing of the God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, be amongst you and remain with you until we meet again. Amen. God bless you, friends. Please take your seats. The family will withdraw to the garden of remembrance. Those of you who wish to go and sit outside and have a cup of tea, and the refreshments will be made available in a short moment.
Announcing.
Announce for those who wish to join us in the garden for the committal, please do so now.
Let's do that bit first.
And the next morning I got up and I went into this, I have this hot seat kitchen where I keep stuff. Like, I got to the first bed and I don't even waste your time. It's not that good. I'm like, where was it? Okay. So I went in my living room, video covers, right. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Gonna buy a new one. You know, you've got my
Sylvie, until we all meet again. Amen. Bring 'em out.
Something in the chair. There's nothing, but yes, yeah, something. Did you ever finish lesson? Forget scripts. I've gone through a little bit. This is like
Did he come in? Did you see him?